So 2 years ago, when Minister Jason Kenney introduced C-11, we actually, like Ocasio and our clinic and FCJ Hamilton House, we actually organized a public hearing, also here in Ryerson. And I think it took us like a week or so to organize the hearing, and Myer was there because at the time the minister refused to have public hearing, so we did our own. And over, I think close to 200 people showed up, just as, as many. So I think it really goes to show how many people are very concerned about this issue, and which is, I think it's a good thing. And I remember also at the time I co-authored an op-ed with Barbara Jackman, Andrew Brown, two very well-known refugee lawyers in the Toronto Star. So we talked about some of the problems with Bill C-11. We talked about the fact that while it's good that the minister was setting up an appeal system, it was bad that he's denying that right to some of the so-called refugees from so-called designated countries. We also argue that the two-tier refugee system might work if we assume that first-level decision makers are always fair. But if they are, we wouldn't need the appeal in the first place. And also, it also assumed that refugee, because of the very compressed time to make a claim and preparation time, it assumes the refugees are able to kind of just find someone to do this, help them do the story in like 15 days, or that they can kind of navigate the system on their own. Again, those assumptions are false. And even at the time, we're not even sure whether there was going to be a right to counsel in some of the procedures. So sometime after that article appeared in the Star, and because of the mounting public pressure, the minister backed down, as Debbie mentioned. Yet, like a virus, talking about a virus that somehow was temporarily suppressed, it wasn't eradicated, and after 2 years, it came back with a vengeance. And this time, it mutated into something even more deadly. So Nathalie has already talked about what's wrong with the bill, so I don't want to go through all of those things. But I would like to, Winnie asked me to kind of talk about, okay, what's going to happen on the ground? What exactly is going to happen on the ground if the bill gets passed? So I will kind of use some of the examples that I see at the clinic to talk about some of the actual changes that might happen. And I also link it back to, although Myer mentioned it, I want to link it back to some of the things that have already happened over the last 5 years. So I'll talk about on the ground first. And I have 4 points to make. So first of all, I think it's important to remember that just like any other law that you can think of in Canada, Bill C-31 is not going to affect everyone equally. People who are most marginalized were always the ones who are the most affected in a negative way. So who is going to be hurt the most? I think as CCR, the Canadian Council for Refugees, and some other groups have pointed out, women, for instance, women who are fleeing sexual or other form of gender-based violence, people who are making claims based on the sexual identity and sexual orientation. Those are the people who are going to lose out the most because you know why? Because a lot of times they may not even name those grounds when they first filed the claim, right? They may, like from my experience, they may not even know that you can make a refugee claim based on gender-based identity. And in another situation, I think the amount of social stigma and sometimes the shame attached to some of those situations make it difficult for people to actually come out to make those kind of claims. And so the short timeline, like the 15 days to file the claim, does not take that into account, right? And it also does not take into account, for instance, people who don't speak English, people who are coming from a country with completely different legal systems, and they don't know anything about the legal system in Canada. They don't know anything about legal aid, so they don't even know that they can apply for legal aid to get someone to help them file the claim. And so it's very difficult for people with linguistic barriers to be able to go through the system. And I think more importantly, that while the government thinks that we're going to crack down on bogus refugees and all that, I think actually it's going to create more opportunities for the unscrupulous consultants out there to screw people up, right? Because the harder, the faster the amount of time it takes for people to file the claim. They don't have time to file, make an application for legal aid, and I'm not even sure what legal aid is going to do to process those kind of situations. And even right now, as we speak, even under the current system, I know that a lot of my clients, when they first got here, they don't go to the lawyers, they don't go to community services, they go to an immigration consultant who has, kind of the shingles in Chinatown or wherever, right? And they don't care, the consultants don't care about what their real claim is. They give you a story and you put it down. If you have 28 days you're doing that, imagine you only have 15 days, right? Then you just put down whatever that other people tell you to put down and figure out the rest later. And I'll give you an example of one of my clients who came to Canada some years ago. And she came in part because she actually, she found out that while she was in China, she found out that she was HIV positive. And there's a lot of discrimination against people with HIV/AIDS in China. And there was no treatment, basically. So she felt that she had no choice, she had to leave. And when she first got here, went to a consultant, consultant said, well, you should claim that you're a Falun Gong practitioner, right? They had never even bothered to ask why she came here. And the client was too ashamed to acknowledge that she came because of the HIV status. So you can imagine someone in that situation, again, like if you have 15 days, this is going to happen more and more. The second thing to note is that there are certain assumptions made about this bill that are used to justify it, but in fact has nothing to do with the reality, right? So for instance, the bill says, well, we want to designate people who come through the regular channels and people who come in through the irregular channels. So the regular channels, I assume, will be like people who buy a plane ticket, get on the flight, and come here. And the irregular channel will be people who come in as a group, whether it's through a boat or through a plane or whatever. But you know what? Whether you come in by your own, whether you come in a group, whether you come by boat or whether you come by plane, they're all irregular. The fact is, people came without the permission of the government. They had to get out somehow, right? So it doesn't matter what the government says. People will continue to use the smuggling mechanism because refugees are desperate, and desperate people take desperate measures. So the bill is not going to, as Nathalie mentioned, is not going to result or make any change in terms of going after the smugglers, because the smugglers will find their way to get around the system. The only people who get caught will be the refugees. And another thing that that was mentioned is that 1 year sort of ban on unsuccessful claimants to apply for permanent residence on humanitarian and compassionate ground. And again, as the critics point out, this will in effect make the H&C application totally useless, because you can't file the claim, you can't file an H&C application within a year. Within that year, you can be deported. But you know what I have to say? Even now, the H&C is kind of useless, right? Because many of the so-called humanitarian compassionate applications are rejected on grounds that are not very humanitarian or compassionate. So I'll give you an example of my HIV positive clients. So when she filed, her H&C application was being rejected, and in rejecting that claim, the immigration officer cited this report on Xinhua News Agency. So for those of you who know anything about Chinese politics, Xinhua News Agency is owned and operated by the Chinese government. So the report says the Premier of China has come out and say that we're going to help people with HIV/AIDS. So the officer said, well, there you go. When she goes back to China, there will be no any problem. So, so I guess immigration officers in Canada have more faith in the Chinese Premier than the people in China. But imagine that, as was mentioned. So that's just one case. But what if Minister Kenny, contrary to everything that he believes in, he was the first person who went to China after June 4th and paid respect to Mr. And so, but imagine, maybe it's not this minister, but the next minister, because Canada wants to build a better relationship with China because of trade and other reasons. So therefore, the Premier of China says this, we should believe him. China is now a safe country. What's going to happen to all those people who are from China trying to make a refugee claim? So, and even then, like, the 1-year ban on H&C application, as I mentioned, is kind of meaningless because it's unnecessary. Just because you have filed an H&C application doesn't mean that you won't be deported. And the reality is there are people who are getting deported every day, even when their H&C application is being processed. And the only way that you can stop it is by going to the federal court, trying to apply for a stay and all that kind of stuff. But you know what? We just had a paper that talks about the wild variation in the decision-making among the federal court judges. The best, well, the one judge that is most sympathetic to a refugee claim is 50 times more likely to find in favor of refugee than someone who is like the least favorable. So 50 times, imagine that. But the same wild variation is found among the decision maker at the first level and at the IRB. That's why we need an appeal. But then that right will be denied to a whole bunch of refugees from the so-called safe country. So I don't have a lot of time, but I just want to mention, as Myer mentioned, there are other things that are going on that shows that we're going backwards, not forward. Sort of like the changes to the family clause, denying people the right to sponsor the parents and grandparents. The minister at some point also mused about putting a conditional visa on people who are sponsored as spouse. And we think that that was a bad idea because it will basically trap women who are usually the sponsored spouse in an abusive relationship. Like if you come here, you're basically required to live with your spouse for 2 years. Otherwise, your condition, your permanent resident status will be taken away from you. So all these things are going on, and I know that there are many people in my community, unfortunately, who are supporting these change, and they said, well, it's good for our country, good for our economy. And I really have to ask them, okay, if you think it's good to have the government take away people's rights under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, because we know that this is what it does, it's good to let the government deny the rights for people to be reunited with the family, because we know what this does. It's good for the government to treat people differently on the basis of the country of origin. We know what this government does. So if you think that's true, if you think that's a good idea, but wait a minute, isn't that what the government did to the Chinese back then through the Chinese Head Tax and the Exclusion Act? But Nathalie said that some of these racist laws that were passed in the old days, no election was lost or won on it. I have to say, I think I disagree with that. At some level, the reason why the government thinks they can get away, and the reason why, for instance, we had the head tax, with the Exclusion Act, it was done by popular demand because people were against the Chinese coming in, because their racism was very real in Canada, particularly in provinces like BC. So at the end of the day, if we get a law like this, we only have ourselves to blame. Because if we do not stop the government from passing a law that we know violates our rights, then what are we doing, right? So I think it's really up to us to tell the government we don't want Bill C-31, 11, or whatever, supersize, downsize, nothing of that. We don't want any of those. Thank you.